Okay, we're gonna move on to our second speaker. Thank you if you're just joining us. Our next speaker is Hollis Jones. She is a research integration specialist for the National Sea Grant Office. Prior to her fellowship, she earned a Master's of Science in Biology from Louisiana State University with Dr. Morgan Kelly, studying the impacts of climate change on eastern oysters in the Gulf of Mexico. Hollis also has a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Northeastern University and professional experience with the Marine Biological Laboratory, the New England Aquarium, and the Pigeon Foundation and Marine Science Center. Today, Hollis is going to tell us about the Sea Grant model for research to application. Please join me in welcoming Hollis.
Hi, everybody. I am just thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you guys today about what I've been working on this year so far with the National Sea Grant Office. So our coastal landscapes are changing. We're seeing increased storm frequency and intensity, and this in combination with sea level rise is leading to devastation of our coastal communities. We also have increased ocean acidification, invasive species, as well as increased harmful algal blooms that are affecting our food supply and our human health, and then the communities that rely on these resources. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that surrounds all of these changes, and decision makers are working to make our coastal communities more resilient using scientifically informed decisions. But what are we doing to provide more information and tools so that these decisions are being correctly formulated? And one of the things we are doing is we're investing in actionable science. And so actionable science supports management decisions through data, analyses, projections, and tools. And so actionable science can also go by a number of different names, such as research to application, and then be abbreviated to R2A or R2O, which is research to operation. And so ideally, actionable science is co-produced with scientists and decision makers, and it really serves the needs of communities. And so I just want to give you guys an example of actionable science before we move on that Wisconsin Sea Grant has been working on. And so this picture is from Lake Erie and is a bunch of dead gizzard shad that died from viral hemorrhagic septicemia, so VHS. And Wisconsin Sea Grant has been working to develop an antibody that you could use to test the spread of VHS. And so you could kind of manage the spread of it before it gets into the other Great Lakes. And so this is science that's being done that has an actionable deliverable. And so how is Sea Grant involved in this? Well, Sea Grant's mission is to enhance the practical use and conservation of ocean and coastal resources for more sustainable economies and environments. And this flow chart here is how Sea Grant does this. They use applied and basic research with our partner universities and organizations across the country, as well as extension and education that directly links us into local communities. And before we move on, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what the term stakeholder means. And so in this context, stakeholders are people or organizations that will be affected by or can affect the outcomes, so the information or the products that this science produces. And so this could be a city planner that will make a more informed decision because of a new model of sea level rise that came out. Or it could be a coastal resident that will have to change their boating practices because of new regulations in the area. And so Sea Grant has 33 university-based programs across the country in coastal and Great Lakes states, as well as the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico. And so this really massive spread is really what allows Sea Grant to tailor their research to the community needs. And each of the orange dots on this map represents an extension professional that is a part of Sea Grant. And the idea behind extension is to extend into the community. And this can take several forms. It could be HACCP training in the state of Louisiana, which is how to handle seafood safely, or community workshops in California preparing residents for coastal hazards, or providing education materials to teachers in Michigan. And so Sea Grant has nearly 400 extension professionals, but what do they really do? Well, they can translate and extend scientific-based information, products, and services into the communities where they live and work. And because they live and work there, and our extension professionals really work to establish lines of communication with the residents, they serve as trusted brokers of unbiased information and engagement. And so my project this year has been to ask, how can we make actionable science work for communities through Sea Grant Extension Network? And so I started calling the different Sea Grant programs and talking to their research coordinators and their extension leads and asking them how they're integrating their science and education and extension. So I want to give you a few examples of what I've heard from people at the different Sea Grants. And our first example comes from Oregon and is our Seacast project. And so this project started by approaching fishermen and asking them what they needed in regards to ocean forecasting. And what they identified as their need was more accurate, accessible, and timely ocean forecasting, especially in regards to salinity. And this was so that they knew when to offload their Dungeness crab hauls. And so after that outreach effort, it started with putting salinity sensors onto crab pots, and so that we could get real-time salinity data from these specific regions. And then a modeler took that information and made maps and plots and brought them back to the fishermen and showed them to them and said, is this useful? Is this what you're looking for? Is it user-friendly enough? And then going back, altering it, and then getting it right. So an iterative process. And so Sea Grant Extension professional Flaxen Conway from Oregon was really involved in this project. And she leveraged her connections with Oregon Sea Grant, Oregon State University, and the fishing community to make weather forecasting as accessible as weather forecasting. And so these maps are really cool. I recommend you take a look at them. They're on the NOAA website. You just type in Seacast. And so this is an example of a community perception of a problem leading to research. But what happens when it goes the other way around and we have research then guiding our extension efforts? Well, for that example, I want to talk to you guys about California Sea Grant. And this is seagrass mitigating the effects of ocean acidification, or OA. And so kelps and seagrasses have the ability to uptake carbon from their local environments, and they can therefore locally buffer ocean acidification. And this is a subject that's been very well studied especially along the California coast. But I just want to highlight one Sea Grant funded researcher, Dr. Tessa Hill from UC Davis, who's found that sediments with seagrasses can hold twice as much carbon as sediment with no vegetation. And this can be really important for calcifying organisms, such as the economically and ecologically important oyster. Love oysters. And so just that small amount of buffering can be really important for them. And so after that research was done, California Sea Grant leveraged it to inform aquaculture efforts in the area, as well as seagrass restoration and protection efforts, and eventually state policy. And so this report came out last year, and it shows us how to proceed, where and when with seagrass restoration and protection. And this report was supported by the Ocean Protection Council and actually presented to the California State Legislature. And so this research leading to extension is having an effect on local policy. And so you remember this image from a few slides ago, it is Sea Grant's approach to the co-production of knowledge through research, extension, education, and communities to create more resilient coasts and coastal communities. But how do our two projects fit into this framework? Our first one, Seacast, started with extension. It started with going to the fishermen and asking them what they needed. And then that eventually led to the research and the modeling and the creation of these maps that could then be used by the fishermen. Whereas for the California Sea Grant project, this started with academic research. It started with looking at how the seagrasses were buffering ocean acidification, and then that was leveraged by extension and education and into the communities through informing aquaculture, as well as this report that influenced policy in the area. And so we have these two different approaches that show us that there are multiple models for research to application success, whether you start with extension and then that grows into research, or the other way around. And so I was wondering, is there one model that is more often successful? And so the Sea Grant network is necessarily extremely diverse because our country is really diverse and the problems that we're facing are really diverse. But is there one? And so we started asking, what makes these projects so successful? And is there any kind of correlations across our programs? And so we found that they're all motivated by stakeholder need, which leads to strong stakeholder buy-in, which can be really important for the community accepting the information and playing a part in it. They also utilize strong established lines of communication and trust, which led to iterative communication. And so communication really suffers when it's one way. And if you leave a group out, despite the credibility of the outcoming information, they might question its legitimacy. And so it's really important to involve all parties. I feel like that is especially exemplified by the Cape Wind project. So also they utilized the co-production of knowledge across research, society, and policy. And they also used multi and transdisciplinary expertise. And I feel like this is an important distinction to make, because when I think of multidisciplinary expertise, we think of maybe a scientist working together with a chemist and they solve a problem. But what we're really doing here is maybe bringing a modeler and an architect and a social scientist together to solve problems. So it really is transdiscipline when we're dealing with climate change. And then also they utilized many partnerships and collaborations that Sea Grant has nurtured over decades. And this is important because we do not and we cannot operate in isolation. And so, okay, actionable science, we're all sold, right? But it's really hard to do. It's fraught with many detours and squiggles. And one of the reasons we end up with these squiggles is because of lack of expertise. So that's why we have to work together with other people and train people in how to get research to that action, because often people are not quite sure how to get there. And it's also being unaware of the resources that are available to you through your state Sea Grant or through your university, who can link you up with communication specialists and etc. Also funding cycles. So funding cycles can be very short. 4 years or 2 years even is not really long enough to often see the whole process from research to application. And a lot of the times project tracking does not continue beyond the funding cycle. And so even if that research does propagate into an application, it might get missed because of a lack of tracking. And also partnerships. Like I just said, partnerships are the reason we're able to do this kind of work, but they can also lead to competing interests to navigate and negotiate. And so how can we improve research to application success? Well, we need to incentivize and elevate outreach and engagement. And so research that delves heavily into management is not as valued in the scientific community. And quite frankly, there aren't a lot of incentives for researchers to even do true outreach and engagement opportunities. And one of the reasons is because management research is not as easily published into high impact journals. And this is especially tough for new faculty that has a lot of pressure to publish in these high impact journals to get promotion and tenure. And so it's really not great to force people to work together, which rarely works, but if we can incentivize them, better to work together. And then also putting more explicit language in RFPs about what outreach and engagement really is. And so publishing in a journal in your field or presenting to people in your field is not really active outreach and engagement. And then also to achieve this by including visible education, outreach, and extension avenues and examples. And so that will make it more obtainable if people can see what should be done or maybe get ideas by sharing what other people are doing. And then to go back even further, we could change the way that we advise our graduate students. So our graduate students are our future PIs, and we rarely define non-academic career paths. This is something that I really struggled with in graduate school because I didn't want to be an academic advisor, but everyone that I was exposed to was an academic advisor. And so one of the ways that Michigan Sea Grant has been addressing this is by having their graduate students have two advisors, the graduate students they fund, an academic advisor as well as an advisor from another agency. And one example is one of their current graduate students is funded by Sea Grant, has their academic advisor and then an advisor from the Department of Natural Resources. And she is studying harmful algal blooms and whether when waves break, the toxins in those blooms become volatilized. And so her research will get directly funneled into state agencies through her partnership. And so these are all ways that we can change academics to improve research to application success. And I want to make it clear that I don't think we should all be doing actionable science. There's plenty of other work to be done in other academic arenas. But I do think we should make it more accessible so that it wouldn't hamper someone's career if they wanted to participate or if they would be dissuaded because they're unsure of the avenues available to them. So another way that we're overcoming this problem that is an example from Louisiana Sea Grant, my home Sea Grant. And so Louisiana has this program called LIDEA, which is Louisiana's Discovery, Integration, and Application Program. And so this is really cool. A lot of researchers that come to Louisiana are not from Louisiana. Louisiana's very unique, and I'll say Louisiana a bunch more times. But they come to this, they get to do this Sea Grant program where they get to speak with politicians, fishermen, residents, city planners, and tribe members and learn more about the area. And so they take them all the way down to the coast, which is actually like far from everything else, like 3 hours away. And this helps new researchers, new faculty and graduate students really frame their research in a new perspective and context. And it also puts them in contact with potential partners for future collaborations. And so like Casey mentioned, I'm from Louisiana and I did my master's at LSU, and my advisor got to participate in the LIDEA program. And she's from California and did her graduate work on sea urchins and copepods on the West Coast and came to Louisiana, and now everyone in her lab does oyster research. And so my project was funded by Sea Grant, looking at the effects of temperature and salinity on the eastern oyster in the Gulf of Mexico and how that might inform freshwater river diversions in the area. And so she really partnered with the Louisiana Sea Grant oyster hatchery down there and framed her new lab at LSU around this new information. And so future steps. I am still working on identifying the best ways to integrate models across the Sea Grant network because it is so diverse. I'm looking to identify and share best practices with the Sea Grant network and our collaborators and partners. And just a few things that are kind of shifting to the surface of being very important are to have clear expectations at the beginning of a project. And so that's no one gets blindsided during the process, and it can keep from a researcher coming to an extension agent at the very end and saying, I need your help with this, and kind of checking this outreach and engagement box. And so we want to have clear expectations about the path of the research at the beginning. We also want to have regular communication, and so that can encourage engagement throughout the process, as well as post-project tracking, like I mentioned earlier, so that we could really see that research come to fruition, because sometimes that process can take decades. And then lastly, we want to have increased student engagement. So the students are our future, and so we want to engage them at every step possible. And so once we share this with the rest of our network and our partners, it can be used as a model for future partnerships and engagements within the Sea Grant network. And so in conclusion, I just want to show you this little cartoon that I think does a good job of showing how information will not be enough to address the problems facing us today, and how we should really focus on engaging with, listening to, and collaborating with stakeholders and scientists across disciplines to come up with solutions to facing us for climate change. And with that, I will say thank you and take any questions.
Any questions in the room?
Hi.
I have two quick questions. My first question is, do you do anything with undergrad students or is it solely grad students? And my second question was, do you do anything with, like, is it specifically the sea or can it be with freshwater as well? Like water reusage and stuff like that, or is it like marine life?
Okay, so the question was whether, I think Sea Grant does work with undergrads as well as grad students, and whether it's marine focused or includes freshwater. And so Sea Grant definitely addresses freshwater issues in all of its states with like transient rivers and things like that, but also we have programs on the Great Lakes, if you are a Great Lakes person. And so definitely it doesn't need to be marine, just it can be community related. It doesn't even need to necessarily be wet, but definitely, you know, preparing us for coastal hazards or working on the blue economy and things like that. There are definitely a lot of opportunities for undergrads, I would say. Are you an undergrad?
Yes.
Yeah, through NOAA you could apply to the Hollings scholarship. I know is one. I don't.
Student webpage has a list of all the undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely connect with your state Sea Grant and see what they have to offer you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think the state Sea Grant offices are networked well enough to share these kinds of lessons and good practices? Is there enough coordination that happens, or do people kind of come up with a good idea and then it doesn't spread around as much as you would hope?
I think that one of Sea Grant's greatest strengths is that it's so spread, but it's also you know, a challenge to spreading information when you have people that are in different time zones in different states. But it's definitely something we're always working on at the national office to create cohesion with all of the programs. And I think as a Knauss fellow, I can just kind of like surf under some of the politics of it and really reach out to everybody.
So I'm coming from an office that does a lot of stakeholder-driven science.
I'm sorry, what?
I come from an office that supports a lot of stakeholder-driven science.
Okay.
So the one challenge that we sometimes come across is that a lot of the people who are going to use the science are focused very short-term. So you have the potential of really funding things that are going to find very short-term solutions that can actually waste somewhat limited funding. Have you come across that in other areas of Sea Grant funding, that kind of thing?
So the question is whether Sea Grant is making an effort to make long-term investments, or
balance the stakeholder-driven science, but also having a long-term perspective. If that's been a challenge or not.
I mean, I think it's maybe always a challenge, but I know that we have a lot of researchers that get Sea Grant funding multiple times in a row, and this can really help them continue to build that body of work. I know there are some programs that do small mini grants for shorter periods of time, and then larger grants that have longer funding cycles as a way to kind of, and they switch off between those two models as a way to kind of address that. But I hope that answered your question.
Well, I'd also say I think the extension network is part of what assists that, because you're not just funding short-term research projects, you have an extension agent that's a full-time employee that can then see that through beyond the life of the research project. So having that extension network allows you to overcome some of those concerns.
So the comment was that the extension network can help us overcome a lot of these problems because they stay longer than the researcher may be funded for, so they can continue that on beyond the funding cycle.
You said that you were incorporating the use of social science in your outreach, and NOAA seems to be becoming increasingly social science aware. Have you considered expressing things in economic terms and using economists who can quantify how, for instance, the improved knowledge of salinity improves the yield?
Yes, and so the question was, Sea Grant and NOAA as a whole are incorporating social scientists more in their work, but are we also utilizing the economic side and economists to help us value natural resources and the research that we're doing?
Or the cost of not doing it?
Or the cost of not doing it, yeah, so absolutely. Part of our reporting requirements is asking people to help, or asking people to estimate the economic impact of the research they've done or jobs created. And I know the national office has recently put out a number of webinars in collaboration with an economist that we contract with to help the state Sea Grant programs put values on the things that they're doing, which is really hard to do. So, but yes, definitely, I think NOAA and Sea Grant are working with more economists, because it's easier for people to see a number and understand that sometimes than a research.
And you get the attention of the funders as well.
Yes, and he said it gets the attention of the funders as well, which is correct. Anything else?
So other than requiring kind of management advisory groups or extension at the beginning of the projects and funding those, have you seen other ways of incentivizing the engagement?
So the question was, other than requiring extension engagement at the beginning of a project, are there other ways that we are incentivizing that kind of collaboration? And I will say we do not require extension to work with a researcher often at the beginning of a project. It is encouraged, and we try to connect people that might work well together. But as far as other ways of incentivizing people, gosh, still working on that. But I think it's becoming, as social attitudes are changing and we're seeing all these problems, it's becoming more desirable to do actionable science. And I think the reason a lot of us get into science is to be like, we want to affect change, and like we see climate change, and so providing avenues to do that. And I think Sea Grant puts a lot of emphasis on actionable science and outreach and engagement, and so in order to get that money, you need to show how you're going to engage the community stakeholders, and so maybe just applying for Sea Grant money.
Is the management of the Sea Grant program here in Silver Spring?
is the management of the Sea Grant program here in Silver Spring. So the national office is here in this building, but the Maryland Sea Grant is in College Park.
Great.
All right.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we can end it there. Thank you very much, Hollis.
Thank you guys.